But happy Milwaukee Day. I was reminded it was Milwaukee Day because there were a number of folks that had the 414 gear on. So for those of you who have the 414 gear on, congratulations. You make the rest of us look really, not stupid. Stupid would be unkind. Lame. Yeah, thanks. Good. Good substitute. I'd like to welcome new GMC members to today's meeting and into membership. Please stand when I call your name. Teresa Mogensen. Maybe not here. Oh, there she is. Teresa, thanks. Pat Laughlin. There he is. Anna Simpson. Andy Stiff. Scott Lindvall. Shannon McToxin. Awesome. And Ben Rickers. Where's Ben? We're thankful for your interest in joining GMC membership. Look forward to our work progressing together. Today we celebrate Milwaukee Day, one of Milwaukee's most historic buildings, Rockwell Automation. We offer a big thanks to today's hosts, Blake Moret and Becky House. Dating back to 1903, the organization has roots in Milwaukee for well over 100 years. We all recognize the infamous Allen Bradley Clock Tower, and Milwaukee natives probably have a familiar connection to Rockwell. Actually, before I go any further, for those of you who have not gotten the selfie, look to that end of the auditorium. You can actually get a selfie. It's really cool. Here to share more about Rockwell's history and how the organization has evolved in 120 years is one of our hosts, Becky House. Becky is Senior Vice President, Chief People and Legal Officer, and Corporate Secretary right here at Rockwell Automation, and a longtime GMC member. Please welcome Becky House.
Thank you so much, Dave. And on behalf of Blake Moret, our Chairman and CEO, and the entire Rockwell team, welcome to Rockwell Automation. We're really excited to host the GMC today, and my hope is over the next few minutes, I'm going to underscore exactly why there's no better place to be on 414 Day when we're celebrating the legacy of our history and the vibrancy of our community than right here at Rockwell Automation. And we're really proud to host our amazing guest today, Senator Baldwin. Thank you so much for joining us today. As well as the renowned and amazing John Gerda, who is going to regale us with Milwaukee's history, and we're really excited to hear from him. First, I want to start with and ground us a little bit on who is Rockwell Automation. And I still am surprised, given our legacy in this community, how many people say, oh yeah, I know Rockwell, but what do you guys do again? So Rockwell is the world's largest pure-play industrial automation and digital transformation company. We're a global company with operations in more than 100 countries around the world, but you're sitting in our headquarters right here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We've got about 27,000 employees, about 1,400 of whom call our headquarters here their home base. Our customers are across virtually every industry. You see it here. Manufacturers, producers, and everything from the automotive sector to life sciences to food and beverages to semiconductors. And what we do is we combine our technology with really deep industry expertise across all of these industries and more to help manufacturers solve their production challenges. We help make them more resilient, agile, and sustainable. And our product offerings include a full portfolio across production hardware, software, and related services. What does that mean? We've got things that are focused on control and visualization, so PLCs or programmable logic controllers, all the way through data management systems, operations management software, and a full range of intelligent devices, things like drives, motor controllers, sensors, and safety components. It's a little bit of grounding in who we are and what we do. Now, as you've all heard, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing about the history of our great city from John in a little bit. And I recognize the substantial risks of delving into history at all with someone like that in the room, especially because the man literally wrote the book on the history of the Bradley family. But here goes, because I think it's really important to take the opportunity to ground us in the deep history of this company. You know, we've been a company for more than 122 years. And it really, the roots go back in Milwaukee to 1903, when the Compression Rheostat Company was formed. That company was later reincorporated as what we all know and love as the Allen Bradley Company in 1909. So we've been here a real long time. The Bradley part of the Allen Bradley equation had roots from a really prominent Milwaukee and Wisconsin family. The founder, Lyon Bradley, who was later joined by his brother Harry, you can read about them on either side of the stage here. Their maternal grandfather was William Pitt Lyons, and William was the Attorney General and then the U.S. District Attorney for what was at the time, back in the mid-1840s, the Wisconsin Territory. It was when Wisconsin became a state in 1848 that he then was elected as U.S. Congressman. He also later served as Milwaukee's mayor from 1860 to 1861. So deep roots in that family tradition. Lyon and Harry's parents, Clara and Henry Bradley, fell on a little bit harder times, and neither one of the brothers ever finished high school. They attended schools here in Milwaukee, but they didn't graduate, but they always had a passion and a knack for science, technology, and innovation. I think it really came from their mom, Clara, who had a number of patents for women's union suits or undergarments that she earned back in the mid-1800s. So innovation went deep in that family. The company got its start and leverage from Lyon's innovation. He got his first patent at 16. I'm a mother of 3 boys. My oldest is 17, 15, and 12. I clearly have not aimed high enough for them in terms of aspirations. Lyon's innovation started there, but it was really an innovation he developed with a compression rheostat that, along with a $1,000 investment from family friend and local physician, Dr. Stanton Allen, began the company back in 1903. Lyon had originally started his business in as an X-ray lab in the downtown Milwaukee in the old PAPS building. So he was destined for greatness early on. The first products of the Compression Rheostat Company were focused on, built on the invention, had controlled motor starters and battery chargers. They had a little bit of corporate intrigue, some relationship with bad partners in the manufacturing space, some bad product design, ultimately then to reincorporate as Allen Bradley in 1909. And younger brother Harry, again, along the tradition of greatness at a young age, joined the company as vice president when he too was 19 years old. The evolution to Rockwell Automation began in 1985 when Allen Bradley was acquired by Rockwell International. In 96, after the spinoff of aerospace and defense business, Rockwell Automation was born. The company headquarters were moved back here to Milwaukee by then CEO and Chairman Don Davis, who many of you knew well for a long time and who just recently passed away here in Milwaukee. So some fun facts about the building and the campus that you are sitting in right now. It includes, in our footprint, the machine shop on First Street, where the business was first started. The campus expansion happened over time with additions in virtually every decade between the 20s and 1969. when the construction of over 1 million square feet was completed. Our campus today is about 3 million square feet. It includes about 100,000 square feet of lab space, in addition to offices, gymnasium, walking track, and manufacturing that is happening on our 8th floor. In the 1950s, a lease was negotiated with the city of Milwaukee so that we could build the connecting ramp that goes across 2nd Street and connect both sides of our campus. And the gymnasium that you're sitting in now has for decades been host to everything from children's holiday parties to features from the Allen Bradley Choir and Orchestra through to the 50s, as well as numerous basketball teams, volleyball leagues. I have a friend and colleague whose father was a lifelong employee of the company. He was an engineer, and when she and her family came through for a tour recently, she looked at this stage and said, "My siblings and I were convinced that guy was the real Santa Claus, who we got presents from when we came for the holiday party." The Bradleys from the beginning were really committed to their employees and causes. Some of it's reflected in the spaces that you see around us. Bowling teams, camera clubs, dances and drama groups were all sponsored. Various campus expansions included the large cafeteria, library spaces, classes and technical rooms, a rooftop exercise area that also hosted numerous employee dances. And then, of course, our iconic clock tower. That clock tower, which was the largest four-sided clock in the world until 2010, was first lit on Halloween night in 1962 by Harry Bradley. Each of the faces is over 40 feet tall, and it takes about 10 minutes to reset the time by 1 hour as we fall back or spring forward every year. And the hands, as you can see in the photograph there, were originally made by Allen Bradley employees. The clock's more recent claim to fame for folks who are fans of the show, of course, comes from Ted Lasso, who in season 1 spoke about spending 3 hours and 42 minutes here alone, of course, a fact he knew because there was a clock. So I'm going to end where I started, which is a thank you and a welcome and reiteration. Hopefully now you understand why I think there's no better place than right here for us to both be celebrating our community and its history as well as its vibrancy as we move forward. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Joel.
Thank you, Becky. I think it's on now. Thank you, Becky and Blake, for hosting us today. And thank you to Rockwell Automation for being a partner in Milwaukee. You know, there are many corporations who are represented and reflected here, and many of you spend your time, your energy, your company's energy doing it, but I don't know that there are many companies who have as long a history and whose commitment to Milwaukee has been as steadfast as Rockwell has been over the years. So thank you. There is no more appropriate place for us to be on 414. And being here today, we're all honored to be in this building as we await a presentation from John and the lessons that he can provide on Milwaukee's history, while considering the innovative evolution that Rockwell has experienced since its founding just blocks away from here in the 1900s. We have progress to share in each of the 4 focus areas, but we're going to do that separately in an email to ensure that that we have the chance to hear from our presenters today. The one thing I do want to mention, if we talk about iconic things in Milwaukee, the Allen Bradley 4-face clock is one, but another one that I think we're all familiar with is the Home Bridge. And I want to acknowledge Ian, Michael Hostad, and those who have been pushing that stone uphill. It was just announced today that both sides of the bridge will be lit by this summer, so congratulations to you. Our first guest today is Senator Tammy Baldwin. Senator Baldwin was elected to succeed the venerable Senator Herb Kohl in 2012, and re-elected in 2018 and 2024. Senator Baldwin is a native of Madison, graduated from Smith College. She went on to earn her law degree from the University of Wisconsin Law School. She started, I think, as a fill-in the Dane County Board in about 1986. filled in the city council, that's right, and then served on the board. And so that started about what has been almost a 40-year career in public service since that time, and we celebrate that. She currently serves on the Committee on Appropriations in the U.S. Senate, the Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. She has been a strong advocate for the southeastern Wisconsin and for Wisconsin in general. Senator Baldwin is going to speak briefly about the atmosphere in the nation's capital, then graciously answer a couple of questions for us. So we're honored to welcome Senator Tammy Baldwin.
Great. So happy 414 Day, everybody. That's great. Otherwise known as wear your t-shirt to work day. So this is the best one I could find in my closet that had Milwaukee emblazoned on the top here. But it's wonderful to be here on a celebratory day and to see so many of you in attendance. And it's great to be here at Rockwell. It's wonderful. I've toured the building a number of times. I haven't spent a lot of time in this room, but this is great. So I wanted to just fill you in on a little bit of what's been going on in Washington, D.C. I know that some of the top advisors to our president, I call them the Steves, Steve Bannon, Steve Miller, said, we're going to start this administration by flooding the zone. And just like, what does that mean? And I think we all kind of know now what flooding the zone means because we're just getting things coming so fast and furiously. On his first day in office, there was a flurry of executive orders, and that's sort of continued on pace since then. We also have seen funding freezes announced early on. In some cases with the caveat that this is just temporary freeze so we can make sure that this funding that's flowing comports with these executive orders that have been signed. But in other cases we've seen longer pauses. And I remember when the first one was announced within the first couple of weeks of the administration, we got so many calls. A Head Start program in Waukesha had to close down for a week. 350 children, 250 families just without notice, figuring out what they are going to do to care for their children and still go to work. We had a fire chief from north central Wisconsin calling my office saying, I just hired 2 firefighters on federal grants. Do I have to let them go? The breadth of the concerns we got was quite dramatic, and I will tell you, a year ago, if you asked me, how many calls do you get at your Senate office on a typical day? I would say between 50 and 100. We have days where we are regularly getting over 1,000 calls a day. Just questions about the tariff, questions about announcements that the Department of Government Efficiency is making, questions about the DOGE access to critical databases like the Treasury Payment Database and the Social Security Administration database and the Internal Revenue Service databases. What does all of this mean? And big announcements, reorganizations at Health and Human Services with no congressional input. And plans on, Valentine's Day, we saw the Valentine's Day massacre, where probationary employees across the federal government had been laid off. One wonders whether they know what the word probationary means in federal service. It is not because you've been put on a improvement plan in your work. It's your first 1 or 2 years, depending on the agency, in a position. And we found when they did this scattershot termination that it also included many veterans and many people who are veterans of federal service. You become a probationary employee once again if you're promoted to a higher position, maybe into a supervisory position. In that position, even if you've worked at the federal government for 10, 15 years, you again become a probationary employee. And so we heard a lot from those individuals. I also want to just reflect that it is so good to be back in Wisconsin. We have a recess this week. The Senate has been working pretty much nonstop. When you have a new administration, they have a cabinet to put together. They have lots of other officials that require our advice and consent. And that means we get to sometimes scrutinize them, meet with them one-on-one. I could throw in some interesting color commentary if you maybe want to ask about it, but you know, sitting down with Howard Lutnick and Jameson Greer, the architects of the tariffs, and with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talking about vaccines, and with all sorts of individuals who are now the president's cabinet. Some of those conversations were quite interesting. Won't surprise you, but we can get into that if you'd like. You know, all of the flooding of the zone that I'm describing right now sort of reached a crescendo last week. Was it last week? Yeah, pretty much last week, the week before, when across-the-board tariffs were imposed on every country, including some places that don't have any human inhabitants. I read some of the interesting articles about an island just with penguins. I'm not sure what our trade relationship is with the islands, but you know, it's very serious. And when we saw now tariffs over 100% on imports from China, 10% across the board remain after the president decided to pause the across-the-board tariffs for 90 days, but nobody really knows what's coming next. And I just came from a roundtable with small business owners here in the Milwaukee area, where each was describing not just the harm that tariffs like this cause for their business and their business plans, but also commentary about the fact that uncertainty is almost a tariff in and of itself. Chaos is almost a tariff in and of itself, and people are experiencing those issues. Now, I don't want to be too much doom and gloom this afternoon. I just want to be honest about what I see happening in Washington, D.C. and its impact on people in Wisconsin. But I'm also proud to be somebody who will work with anyone to get the job done for the people I represent. And there are still, there's challenges, but there are also opportunities to do that. I know one of the things I hear from a lot of you and other business leaders across the state is challenges with workforce. And that tends to be an issue where I can easily reach across the party line and work on issues like access to technical education, access to apprenticeships, modernizing our very old apprenticeship laws. If you don't mind me doing a quick tangent here, I'm really proud of the fact that Wisconsin really was the first state in the country to have an apprenticeship program in law. It took a few years for the federal government to follow suit, but in 1937, the federal government passed apprenticeship laws, and they have not been modernized since then. And I have found some bipartisan appetite to do that, to broaden the opportunity for apprenticeships and help us solve some of our challenges with regard to having a high-skilled workforce for the things we do. While I may adamantly disagree with this president's approach to trade policy and the chaos that it has created, I do believe that there's work to be done to invest in American workers. And I've presented the president and others with an alternative to deal with trade cheats. And there are trade cheats on this globe, and we have to have tactics and ways to deal with that. But I also understand that we are a state that makes things. That's our history. And I understand that we have to have different tools in our toolbox than the ones that the president is using to keep our manufacturing sector strong, vibrant, and growing. And I'm willing to work across the aisle to do just that. Looking to the future, as I said earlier, there's some funding that has been previously allocated and granted in programs like the CHIPS and Science Act, and we have our biotech hub that I was very proud to be a part in helping bring here. We also have the bipartisan infrastructure law and investments across the state and across the city that are pending. But some suggest that they might be in jeopardy, and I'm going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that we make good on those commitments. And I look forward to working with many of you in this room to make sure that we see through the commitment made to our biotech hub, and that we see through our commitments made to expansion of broadband and expansion of the reconnection of communities with our transportation infrastructure and our commitment to transit, all of which are vital to helping Wisconsin, but Milwaukee, continue to grow and continue to be vibrant. So I'm going to be there fighting for those commitments and seeing them through. And thank you once again for having me here today.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. I'm going to streamline our thing to just a couple of quick questions for you to answer. Again, one, it's not an ideological or partisan statement to say that these are hugely disruptive times for everybody. You have nonprofit, private sector, public sector leaders assembled here today. You know, just looking over the last week, the potential closing of the Wisconsin Manufacturing Extension Partnership, the closing of a Head Start office in Region 5. The things that in this morning's paper talk about domestic violence cuts and health and human services. And a number of us either work in those areas or work with those who are involved in those. What advice do you have around for the community, for those of us who work either directly with those things, are recipients of those dollars, or work with organizations that do? What is the best way for the community and those assembled here, the leaders assembled, to respond and react to that?
Thank you for that question, and let me complain, but also then be hopeful and be constructive in answer to that. The lack of transparency in this administration, and certainly in particular departments, has been deeply disturbing to me. For a while, there was a gag order placed on employees at Health and Human Services, whereby they wouldn't answer reporter questions, they wouldn't answer questions from the public, they wouldn't answer questions from members of Congress, even those of us charged with overseeing that department. And so it is not easy to get answers and to break through this chaos, although I think we're not letting up at all. But I think the most powerful thing you can do is both make sure that I'm aware of what's happening, make sure that, and don't assume that we are, make sure that my counterpart, Ron Johnson, is aware of what's happening, and your House member, whether that's Gwen Moore or depending on where you're based, Brian Stile or Congressman Fitzgerald or Grothman, make sure that they're hearing what's happening and are aware of what's happening. In terms of my office, I told you the phones are ringing off the hook. I'm not complaining about that. That is helpful to me. And when you have a moment to actually share a story, not just I'm trying to get information on the closure of the regional Head Start office or whatever, but if you can share a story like they did in Waukesha, when I talked to a Head Start employee who had worked for the Waukesha Head Start for 30 years. And she got laid off for that week and just didn't know what the future looked like and cared deeply about the children and families that they served. And to be able to put more context on that and lift these stories up is really important to our fighting back. You know, that first funding freeze, the administration backed down and OMB rescinded its memorandum, its directive to freeze funds within about a week because of the pushback. There's been other actions that they have put forward that then they walked back. I think, they said they weren't going to let up on the tariffs, but in about a week they did. It's a pause for 90 days. The chaos is that we don't know what's next. But that was because people spoke out and shared stories. And then the other thing I want to share is when there's a specific issue that we can double team with you. By way of an example, we were a big dairy state, as I don't have to tell anyone here. There's a program that I helped foster called the Dairy Business Innovation Initiative, which allows sort of micro grants to dairy farms to improve their efficiency or to grow their export markets or to do other things. And there was a bunch of farms in our area that were awarded grants and then did individual expenditures in reliance on getting those grants. And those grants were then frozen. They were already out the investment or whatever their application, whatever their project was. And because I became informed about it, I was able to bring it up to the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary Rollins, and she was able to quickly determine that these were not grants that were being reviewed because they somehow weren't in conformance with one of the president's executive orders, and they were able to flow then. And so we can double team some of these things. Doesn't always prove successful, but often it does. And so please make sure that I know about that.
Another question around federally directed spending, or earmarks. You're a member of the
Yes.
Appropriations Committee, and while there's been a lot of discussion around those, it's been very valuable to the community, and you've done with the rest of the delegation a good job. I would mention like the HERA, the Higher Education Regional Alliance, recipient of $1.5 million that actually flows through the Greater Milwaukee Committee to a bunch of institutions for micro-credentials and for upskilling that businesses need. So like those are very specific things we've been able to accomplish there. The future of that program, in some doubt, can you give just for the community here where you see that going in the immediate and what's the longer term horizon potentially for that?
Yeah, so I have some hope for the future. I will say that I do believe that there's some trust that needs to be rebuilt between Democrats and Republicans on the Appropriation Committee. Because in the fiscal year 2025, we wrote all of our bills in the Senate, funding every agency, every department of the federal government. And we worked really hard to make them bipartisan. I, last year, chaired the subcommittee of appropriations that funds the Education Department, the Health and Human Services Department, and the Labor Department. So those three departments. And we wrote a bill that passed through our committee on a vote of 25-2. That shows you that we can do bipartisan work. But the reason we have to rebuild trust is because just a few short weeks ago, when we faced a government shutdown because our continuing resolution was expiring, instead of pushing to get each of our bills funding government over the finish line, where we had done incredibly bipartisan work, instead, our counterparts walked away from the table and passed a continuing resolution that was completely partisan, not bipartisan. And so I want to have faith when I work really hard on this process to put together a bill that not only reflects Wisconsin priorities, but also can pass the Senate on a strong bipartisan basis. I want to know that we're going to stick with it and not walk away from the table at the 11th hour. And that process is beginning. And I want you to feel hopeful about this because just last week, I was able to talk with my counterpart. She is now the chair of this same subcommittee that I'm talking about. And we talked about earmarks. That's the word we don't use very much anymore, but congressionally directed spending. And we're committed to it moving forward. I have put out my request to have your ideas gathered so we can consider them for earmarks moving forward. And I trust that we'll be able to create a path to do that. But I want a commitment from my counterparts. They're not going to walk away from the table at the 11th hour once we've done all of that hard work. And I know many of you worked on the fiscal year 2025 measure. We had some amazing things set aside for Milwaukee, the city, the county, and projects that nonprofits that you work with day in and day out wanted to move forward that were just, just disappeared. And I don't want to see that happen again.
Okay, last question, and it gets to alignment. I think the stuff that happened at the state level, the alignment of the civic sector and the public sector to get the sales tax increase in Milwaukee and to get more state shared revenue. Like, that's an example of the alignment that we have had. And I guess today on 414 Day, how does this community stay aligned to help support you and to do the things that we need to do at the federal level during this time of disruption and some uncertainty?
Yeah, well, to the degree possible, speak with one voice. And that's why you've been successful on all the things you just ticked off, is because you have spoken together. You have spoken in a very unified way. I kind of sprinkled in a few worrisome issues that I have about commitments of funding that have already been made to this community that I want to see through, and I know you want to see through. The CHIPS and Science Act did some amazing things related to supply chain and creating incentives to make things here. But it also launched this incredible initiative that we sort of nicknamed the Tech Hubs. And the fact that Wisconsin landed one with a coalition of a consortium of 15 companies, including Rockwell Automation, was the result of your commitment and hard work and the amazing stuff that happens in this state. I do not want to see this administration walk away from that commitment. This is something that is sort of high risk, high reward. But I don't want Doge to come in and say we have better ideas. And so we're going to have to speak with one voice to make sure that that commitment remains. And on some of the infrastructure that I was talking about, I was on the phone with Secretary Duffy just last week saying, what do I need to know about the awards that were made in the last couple of months of the Biden administration that the Trump administration is saying we want to review. We want to review them to make sure that they comport with the president's executive orders. Well, we've got to fight to make sure those commitments remain, because it's not just a given. And speaking with one voice is going to be very, very helpful in that regard.
Thank you. I hope everyone will give Senator Baldwin a round of applause. Thank you very much for your time. Apparently we're taking a photo here quickly, too. Thank you, Senator Baldwin, for your time you spent with us today and your work on behalf of Milwaukee's community. You are welcome at any time as things happen in Washington and as we can be helpful to you and you to us. So thanks very much. Now, it's not often that a U.S. Senator is the undercard. This might be the first time that the U.S. Senator is undercard is John Gerda, but I'm excited to introduce Milwaukee historian John Gerda. Many of us likely drove past the entirely unassuming intersection of First and Florida on our way down to Rockwell Automation today. It's just a few blocks away from here. But that intersection and the square blocks around it served as the birthplace for companies with names like A.O. Smith, Kearney and Trecker, Harnisch-Figger, Laddish, Nordberg, and yes, Alan Bradley, whose successor company serves as our host and still maintains a huge presence in our community today. How do I know that? Because I have read many of John Gerda's 8 books about our community. I'll also say that John became one of my son's favorite teachers without ever really setting foot in his classroom. My son, incidentally, who I've talked about at various times, tried to get a prom date for and homecoming. He turns 18 years old today. For the first dozen or so years of his life, he truly believed all this 414 stuff was about him. We didn't disabuse him of that notion, but he has wised up. But his favorite high school class as he approaches his graduation has been a Milwaukee history class that uses John Gerda's texts as his books as the text and allows the city to become a living laboratory for young men. It's wonderful to see them start to appreciate and understand their communities in new and different ways, which is exactly why we should all continue to celebrate and learn from John Gerda, why we've invited him to be with us today. John's Milwaukee born, has been honing his craft and studying his hometown since 1972, published 8 books focused on various historical aspects of Milwaukee, including The Making of Milwaukee, which is now in its 4th iteration, including refreshed text that covers the tumultuous period since 2000. Making of Milwaukee was also turned into an Emmy Award-winning documentary that aired in 2006, and today John will share a live version of his historical works. Please welcome the Milwaukee treasure, John Gerda.
Thank you, Joe. So your show will be 414 forever. And happy 414 Day. I looked at the old phone books. Not everyone can celebrate an area code. 414 is Milwaukee proper. Waukesha County is 262. Their day is February 62nd. That doesn't work out very well. It's an honor to be here before the GMC. We've talked about this for a while, but you have been a force for positive progress in Milwaukee since 1948. And you began as the 1948 Corporation. And the link was the Wisconsin State Centennial back in 1948. They thought there was more work to do, so kept on going, and with a new name as the GMC. So I'm glad to be here, and your focus has been relentlessly on the future. The future has only one place to come from, and that is the past. So what I hope to do this morning, this afternoon, is kind of give you kind of a low-flying 30,000-foot view of Milwaukee's history from the very early years to the recent past. So you pretty much have to begin any history of Milwaukee on Lake Michigan. We are the city by the lake. It is our source of drinking water, our source of recreation. It is our source of weather in many cases, and also kind of sets our mood, but it is also why Milwaukee's here. The reason Milwaukee exists, where it does, is that we have the best and have the best natural harbor on the western shore of Lake Michigan. Chicago not accepted. So back in the first years of urban settlement here, back in the 1830s, you had to have a river mouth, and in Milwaukee's case, the Lower Milwaukee River was 18 feet deep, so it could float anything that was on the Great Lakes. So we had the best harbor, and that meant that we were the premier urban opportunity on the western shore of Lake Michigan. That's why we're here. So now that's been somewhat, kind of, in terms of the priorities here, not as high, although we still have a very active and a profitable port as well. So the port is what mattered. It didn't matter that once you got up the river a bit, it was kind of wet. Milwaukee had abundant wetlands. You'll see in a slide just a few ahead. The biggest was the Menominee Valley. And this is a picture of the Horicon Marsh, but it's much of what the Menominee Valley might have looked like back in the very early years here. The word Menomin or Manoomin means wild rice in the Algonquian languages. This was a grocery store. Native Americans had made their homes here for millennia before whites began to think about arriving. So you have above the wetland, you have these dense hardwood forests, and they were so thick in the early years of urban settlement. There's one account of a pioneer saying that you could travel from Milwaukee to Waukesha in high summer without once seeing the sun. Imagine that traveling west on 94 today, rather different landscape. So because you have those resources of woodland and wetland and wildlife, this was an important center for Native American settlement. The tribes who were here before anybody came from Europe were the Ho-Chunk and the Menominee. Well, they are the pre-contact tribes who've been here for millennia, since the last glacier melted back about 10,000 years ago, going way back to what they call the Paleo-Indians. And they were joined in the 1600s by tribes who were fleeing warfare farther east, including the Odawa and the Ojibwe, and above all, Potawatomi, came in the 1600s as well. So you have kind of this confederation of tribes that made their homes here in Milwaukee, and it was kind of a forecast or foreshadowing of the diversity of Milwaukee in its present incarnation. So you have the first people of European background who had contact with the natives were the French-Canadian fur traders, going back to the 1600s. And he was not by any means the first, he was the last. But you know the diorama down there in the Public Museum? Solomon Juneau's trading post. In 1825, he and his wife Josette, who was part Menominee by ancestry, they put their trading post on the corner of Water Street and Wisconsin Avenue, right in the crosswalk. Imagine that in the landscape of today. And the reason they settled there was that was the first dry ground, dependable dry ground above the mouth of the Milwaukee River. Everything downstream was a wet, complete swamp or marsh. So they put their trading post there, and I describe history very simply as why things are the way they are. Water in Wisconsin is still the commercial nexus of downtown Milwaukee. It goes back to 1825 when the Juneaus put their post there. So once things get in a certain direction, they tend to hold that direction for a very long time. So this is a rare photograph of Solomon Juneau. He was a very unusual figure, one of kind of his feet in two worlds. When he came here back in 1818 as a teenager, as a voyageur, coming from the Montreal area, he was certainly, depending on Milwaukee, to remain a wilderness. Well, they had to have the native supplies, all the furs that were kind of the currency of the time, and he stayed to become Milwaukee's first mayor. Who did that? We kind of straddled those incredibly different incarnations of Milwaukee. And what you have to realize is the timing of his settlement here in Milwaukee, was the last years of the fur trade, were the time when you had this tidal wave of settlement that was kind of cresting in this area, been washing west from colonial times. And what brought people here in those early years was the schooner. We were people of the schooner back in those years. What opened the door was the Erie Canal, 1825. And that linked Albany and Buffalo, New York. You could take an all-water route. And you probably got off once in a while, but you could take an all-water route from the East Coast to Chicago. And that was hugely important. 1,000 miles of all-water route into the interior of the continent. That's not common any place in the entire world. So that really helped to put Milwaukee on the map. And because it had this huge advantage of a great harbor, attracted people who really knew what was going on in terms of the commodity they had here, the resource they had here. So people came from the East Coast, the so-called Yankee Yorkers, including this guy, this is Byron Kilbourne. This is his charm school graduation picture. And he came here back in 1834, and he found Juneau on the east side of the river, so that was someone else's territory. He claimed the west and tried very hard to put the east side out of business. He was not a guy, as the report card would have said, he played well with others. So this is the map of Milwaukee back in 1836. See all the wetland, central Milwaukee, the whole third ward, much of Walker's Point, much of the west side of downtown. So again, it was the harbor resource that mattered. The landscape itself was a secondary consideration. So you have Wisconsin Street, which is where Juneau's house was, and because it was so wet, Chestnut Street, without the T there, that was where Kilbourne lived back in 1834. So you have east side and west side, Kilbourne Town and Juneau Town, who didn't get along especially well. To make things a bit more interesting, you can see that small point of land on the bottom of the slide here. There's Walker on it. It's Walker's Point. We are on the south end of Walker's Point right here at Rockwell. And that was quickly erased, vaporized, to become landfill for all the wetland in the area. But that became the third settlement in pioneer Milwaukee, and probably should have been downtown because the front door is the harbor. What's the first stop upstream? It's Walker's Point. So George Walker was someone who became kind of he was not by any means a shark in real estate or business. He had no money. He had no political connections. And it took him 7 years before he had clear title to his land. Green Bay interests, at the time when Green Bay was bigger than Milwaukee, jumped his claim. So he had to have an act of Congress to have clear title that he could sell without people he sold to being evicted. He was also described as a somewhat free liver. He was fond of dining. This guy weighed 350 pounds at the time before fast food. And despite his size, he said to be the finest ice skater in Wisconsin territory with the qualification when the ice was thick enough. If there was one guy you could go back and have a beer with, it would be George. Somebody I would much enjoy meeting. So because he was kind of effectively sidelined by all those handicaps, the race for kind of leadership in Milwaukee was between the east and west sides. And there's no doubt that Byron Kilbourne was the most aggressive competitor. This is a Kilbourne published map from 1836. It is called the City of Milwaukee. What's missing? The entire east side. Completely absent. This is propaganda. No, this is Byron Kilbourne kind of papering the wayside inns and boarding houses, hotels between here and the East Coast with advertisements saying, invest here, settle here. So trying everything he could to make sure the West Side had the early advantage. So you have this rivalry, and it wasn't so much personal with Juneau, but it was certainly between East and West Sides, and certainly personal in the case of Kilbourne. And that rivalry came to a head over the issue of bridges. One was built in 1840. The second one was built on what's now Juneau Avenue, ironically because that was where Kilbourne lived. Back then it was Chestnut Street, in those early years. So 1845, you have this bridge connecting east and west sides. The West Siders suffered in silence for a time, then one warm night in that summer, they reasoned that what touched their side was theirs to do with as they wished. So they used axes and hatchets to liberate the footings on the west side, the west bank of the river. So it kind of floated downstream, kind of a stately bridge going down for the mouth of the Milwaukee River, and blocked traffic north. So the east siders get up in the morning and find they can't get out to the west. So what do? They cut off the west side bridges to the south. Well, now no one can get anywhere in central Milwaukee. So you have the Great Bridge War of 1845, and no one died, but they did trade blows and did shed blood for the greater honor and glory of the east or west sides. And the Milwaukee Sentinel, which by then was publishing, described the results. A number of combatants were considerably injured, though not seriously. But good qualification. So what they finally realized, they're scaring people away. Well, this is a boom town. People are kind of flooding west looking for a place to settle. Who would have settled in Milwaukee back in 1845 when you have a Hatfield and McCoy feud going on in full swing? So the end of January 1846, both sides, and by now Walker's part of the party, even though a minor party, they joined forces as the City of Milwaukee with 10,000 people. And 2 years before Wisconsin became a state. So this was the first city, the first urban opportunity in the entire state of Wisconsin. Well, you have one city finally, and there is one reminder of that kind of sectional rivalry back in the 1830s and 40s. Before there were bridges, Byron Kilbourne saw no need to lay out his streets to conform to these sides. So when they finally joined, you have these dog-leg crossings of the Milwaukee River. A civic antique. Imagine what it would cost to rationalize that, straighten those roads. It won't happen. So this will remain as long as there's a Milwaukee kind of an antique at a time when people were not getting along especially well in frontier Milwaukee. So you have Milwaukee is on the map and continues to grow. And sometimes we overstress the difference between the city and the country. They were absolutely a mutual dependence between the city and the country as Milwaukee and Wisconsin grew. As that farming frontier got pushed farther and farther west, all those farmers needed a city as both a market for their produce and as a way to have finished goods coming in from the East Coast and from Europe. Milwaukee was the point of exchange. That was our first economic activity. So you have, I'm not sure what Grant was doing reading the paper here. Unusual pose, but this was typical of all this land being homesteaded and the farming frontier going all the way out to the Mississippi. So you have transportation was hugely important as you have that first stage in Milwaukee's history. And there were no breakwaters, so it was the river that was the harbor of refuge. That's where the safe anchorage was. So you had all the way up to Cherry Street. It was lined with docks and where the boats pulled up. So this is Michigan and Broadway. The building on the left is on the side of the grain exchange. You have a schooner under full sail going upstream in the Milwaukee River. These guys knew how to sail. Just imagine the skill involved in kind of getting that boat up. And overland transportation was just as important, had a means of getting goods out and products in. So back in the 1850s, Milwaukee had this network of plank roads, which were kind of oversized wooden sidewalks. And they are still here, although no longer wood. They tell you where they went. On the north side, Green Bay, Appleton, Lisbon, Fond du Lac, still the names in the landscape. South side around here, Muskego, Wind Lake, where you have diagonal roads anywhere in Milwaukee or this region. They're almost certainly old pioneer era plank roads that were the easiest way to get from country to city. So it's still part of the landscape of 2025. But before long, those plank roads were put out of business by the next huge development of technology that was the railroad. The first railroad comes in 1851 and puffs from Milwaukee to Waukesha at the breakneck speed of 30 miles an hour. Solomon Jr. was on board, and he said he'd never seen anything like it. It was a revolutionary development. And once again, we meet our old friend Byron Kilbourne, a little softer view of Mr. Byron. He founded not one but two railroads. The second was in La Crosse in Milwaukee, which is now the Amtrak line. So it's that corridor. It goes way back to the 1850s. And it crosses the Wisconsin River at a settlement that was called Kilbourne City, which is now Wisconsin Dells. So that's something that Byron Kilbourne put on the map. And he was determined to make this the dominant railroad in Wisconsin. And back in those years, after the natives had been dispossessed, the government had taken control of their land, they were selling it for $1.25 an acre, the incoming settlers. And they gave railroads land grants. They gave them thousands of acres as a means of extending their reach and thereby importing settlers to those unsettled lands. So 1856, the state had a lot of land to give away to railroads. Kilbourne was determined to make his railroad the recipient. He bribed the entire state legislature, and only 6 said no. Everyone else said, glad to help you. So that was, it won the land grant, but he lost his good name. This is a cartoon from Harper's Magazine, still very much in print, showing a railroad tycoon kind of buying the Wisconsin legislature at the political market, which is not quite the image Milwaukee and Wisconsin wanted to project to the rest of the world, but that was the reality back in those years in the 1800s. So despite their checkered histories, railroads were hugely important to Milwaukee's future. And the fact that we had a homegrown railroad, the Milwaukee Road, in contrast to Chicago Northwestern and Chicago, they were almost proxy in kind of the battle between Chicago and Milwaukee for primacy. The fact that we had our own homegrown railroad enabled Milwaukee to not just survive but thrive in the deep shade of Chicago. Not usual for cities of the size of Milwaukee and Chicago to be so close together. And the railroads were hugely important in making that happen. So they were kind of like, they were arteries of commerce. They were funnels that poured all the agricultural wealth of Wisconsin into and through Milwaukee. And what that meant back in those early years was grain. Wisconsin was a wheat state, and the railroads poured all that grain into Milwaukee. And this was the grain exchange. It was completely savaged and rebuilt back in 1983. But this is what it was like back in the 1800s. Now it's a place for weddings and proms. This was the nerve center of Milwaukee's economy. This was where the deals were made and where the money was made. And part of this network of commodities exchanges that helped to set the price of produce internationally. So Milwaukee was a player. By the early 1860s, we were the largest shipper of wheat on earth. So this really was the foundation of an early prosperity. And the skyline wasn't smokestacks, it was grain elevators. So that was what you saw when you would go up and down the rivers or passing railroad cars as well. So you had Milwaukee's growing in this symbiotic relationship between city and country. So you have people coming in the early years were largely from the East Coast, New York and New England. But before long, they were outnumbered by immigrants coming directly from Europe. By 1860, which is or 1850 rather, just 4 years after Milwaukee becomes a city, 64% of Milwaukee's population was foreign-born. We were a city of immigrants, going way back that far. And by far the largest group was Germans. How many Germans in the room? If you think just a quorum. So the Germans were in majority of Milwaukee's population as early as 1860, and are still the largest single group in the Milwaukee area, Warren County metro area. And perhaps the biggest thing they had in common was that they had nothing in common. Other groups were one religion, one economic background, one political persuasion. Germans were just all over the lot. So this is Old St. Mary's on Broadway before it was old. It was founded the same year as the city itself, back in 1846. So about a third of the population, the German population was Catholic, another third maybe Lutheran. Reformed Germans as well. And before the Civil War, there were 3 German Jewish synagogues as well. So you have kind of this rather diverse kind of religious platform. There were also groups who were anything but religious. You have the 48ers who came here back in 1848. They had led a revolt against royal rule in the German states. There was no Germany at the time. 1871 is when they were unified. And they were exiled for their troubles. And these were educated, literate, forward-thinking people. They're the ones who began the musical, dramatic, theater societies, and also the Turners, which began as an avowedly socialist organization, as well as a place for gymnastics. And there was one 48er who said he longed for the day when the last priest had been hanged with the intestines of the last prince. They were both anti-Roman and anti-royal. And most of them, by far a large number, were very orthodox people just making a living. And their settlement was largely on the west side of the Milwaukee River. The old Kilburn town became Germantown in Milwaukee of the later 1800s. And 3rd Street, no, not Martin Luther King Drive, this was the German downtown. And there are stories, whether they're verifiable or not, merchants putting signs in their windows saying, "English spoken here." They wouldn't scare away the occasional non-German kind of wandered through looking for a loaf of bread or a basket for laundry. So it wasn't just the Germans, the Irish were here in Milwaukee as well. And they were about 15% of Milwaukee's population back in 1850. And they had their own volunteer firefighting company, and the firefighters then were they're largely ethnic. They're like clubs, for people of one background or another. And there were stories from those early years about the fire company spending more time dousing each other than they would the flames when they arrived at the scene of a blaze. So you have one incentive for a full-time firefighting force. And they lived largely in the 3rd Ward, which was a sinkhole covered with mud by Irish brawn and filled with Irish houses as the muck dried. This was not the place you would have taken your out-of-town guests to show them the best that Milwaukee had to offer. It was called the Bloody Third because of outbreaks of violence there. Had the highest arrest rate in Milwaukee and the highest number of saloons as well. So kind of rough territory back in those early years. So it was a pretty poor community. You see from the young men here, their torn overalls. But they had the same background. They were Catholic, they were Democratic, and they were working class. So they were very much a monolith, which helped a whole lot, especially because they spoke English. They were an early force in politics. And this is City Hall on the present site of the 200 East Wells building. It was built back in 1895. And from the days when a native of Ireland was Milwaukee's first village president, the recent past, Irish people have always had kind of an important impact on public life here in Milwaukee. Look at the roster of judges in Milwaukee and check the Irish names. More recently, names like Barrett and Brennan have been part of the public life here as well. So you have Irish are here, as well as the Germans, but this was not just European. This needs to be underlined. There were black Americans here as early as 1835. A man named Joe Oliver voted in Milwaukee's first election. And by 1850, there were roughly 100 African Americans here, including this handsome couple. This is Sully and Susanna Watson, who came here back in 1850. He was a whitewasher, she was a seamstress. Imagine what that dress weighed back in those early years. And they were kind of matriarch and patriarch of Milwaukee's black community. Sully was a former slave who had bought his own freedom in Virginia and moved north first to Columbus and then to Milwaukee. My current project is to work on a documentary about Milwaukee's African American history. That's good. We're spending a lot of time with that story. Hope to have that done later in the year. So you have those first 100, and they continued to grow. By 1869, there were enough African Americans in Milwaukee to begin their own church. So St. Mark AME, African Methodist Episcopal, was founded back 1869, and they bought a church on 4th and Kilbourne, where the Hyatt Hotel is, and there's a marker identifying the place where St. Mark got going, and they're still doing just fine up on 16th and Atkinson. So a pillar of Milwaukee's black community. And what I would underline is this is 30 or 40 years before the Italians, before the Serbs, before the Greeks, other European groups had enough people to begin their own places of worship. So again, the roots are a good deal deeper than many of us realize. You have Milwaukee roughly 1860. It's one of those typical bird's eye views from the 19th century. And Milwaukee by 1860 had a population of 45,000, and that was good for 20th place in the U.S. between Detroit and Cleveland. Think about that, 45,000 people. That's fewer than Wauwatosa or West Allis today. And what that underlines is how rural American society was back in those years. We were a nation of farmers. And you could be in the top 20 with 45,000 people. So you have those early years, again, that dependence between city and country. And Milwaukee kept on growing, and you can kind of chart the economy of Milwaukee in sort of almost like shifting gears. First gear is shipping. We were a point of exchange between markets to the east and producers to the west. The second gear is processing. So we are still tied to the country, but what we're doing is adding the value here. So not just shipping wheat, but turning it to flour. So Milwaukee became a major milling center. You have tens of thousands of hogs and cattle shipped to Milwaukee every year. This is the stockyards in the valley just north of the Mitchell Park Domes, long gone. So they were shipped here by the thousands, and they were disassembled. And the insides went to meatpacking plants, Layton, Plankinton, Cudahy, and Milwaukee became a major meatpacking center. And the outsides went to tanneries. Milwaukee was the largest tanner of leather on earth in 1890. And these are all Germans, Pfister, Vogel, Trostel, Lewin, Gebhardt. So they had learned to trade the old country and scaled it up when they got here to Milwaukee. So the biggest of the big tanners here was Pfister and Vogel, which is just stone's throw from here. And they were the biggest in the world, and that's the 6th Street Viaduct on the right side of the lithograph here, a little different 6th Street Bridge. And just to talk about a paradigm shift, this is now a gated community. And that would just astound the workers who spent their days kind of some of the smelliest jobs imaginable in American industry. So tanning was a very big deal. And barley grown in the countryside was turned to malt. And you have hops grown as well, good water, Milwaukee, so beer. The ingredients were important, but Germans were the most important thing. In fact, there were so many Germans. That was the reason Milwaukee became a beer center. So before the Civil War, Milwaukee had 26 breweries, more than 2 dozen. Micros by minor standards, but owned by guys with things like Miller and Schlitz and Best, which became Pabst. By 1874, Pabst was the largest brewer in America. 30 years before they started. 1844, they began. 1874, they're number 1. And Schlitz and Blatz were in the top 12 in the same year. So very quickly, Milwaukee becomes the nation's most important producer of beer. And here's, before they had beer trucks, they had beer wagons. And these are guys that you can see the leather aprons as you go close. Horsing these barrels around, getting to saloons. Not a job for the faint of heart. But this is the marshalling yard inside the Pabst Brewery, which is now the brewery, mixed-use development. And even the earth itself provided economic activity. The clay beneath your feet right here has a high magnesium and calcium content. When you turn that to bricks, it gives you this very pleasant pale yellow color. So we've known ever since as Cream City, 414 day in Cream City. And not too far from here, up in Dodge County, you have iron ore mines, Iron Ridge, Theresa, Horicon, Maple, and that was the raw material for Milwaukee's first heavy industry, which was the Milwaukee Iron Company, on the south end of the Daniel Home Bridge. It opened back in 1868, and before long was the second largest maker of railroad rails in the country. 1,500 workers in the 1870s. That's big in 2025, and it was just off the charts back in the 1860s. So you have third gear, shipping, processing, manufacturing. So now we become the machine shop of the world. And the wayfinder there was this guy, Edward P. Alice. In 1867, he takes a bankrupt machine shop and moves it down to First in Florida, makes sawmill and floor equipment, and in time, the largest steam engines on the planet. So this is the catalyst. This is one of those events that took place, as Joe said, on First in Florida. Within 2 blocks, you have everyone from Allen Bradley to A.O. Smith to Filter, Fowler and Stoll, Laddish, just Silicon Valley. I mean, this amazing burst of explosive burst of energy, innovation, and capital. So they keep on growing down to Walker's Point, and they outgrow their facilities. So they buy land west of Milwaukee, opened that back in 1901. The merger makes them Allis-Chalmers. What do you call that settlement? Call it West Allis. Allis works down at Walker's Point, West Allis a little farther west. Meanwhile, back in Walker's Point, you have these guys with big ideas. The guy on the steps there is Henry Harnischfeger, and he becomes the maker of the largest overhead crane supplier in the entire world. And tenants for him included Chainbelt and Norberg. It was a job shop, and they kind of began there and kind of outgrew those headquarters and became nationally important figures. And as Walker's Point filled up, you have other industries like Kearney and Trecker, machine tools, a couple of buddies, work on machine tools, machines that make machines. And you have, as the Walker's Point fills up, you have this inviting land in the Menominee Valley. It's all wet, but you can fill that. So what they did was, the term they used was they borrowed gravel from both sides, didn't return it. They pushed all that gravel down and whatever they could find, cinders, ashes, garbage, to fill the Menominee Valley. And this is one of the major employers down there, the Falk Gear Shop, which was way back on the foundation of an old family brewery back in 1856. And they're still there as a sub, I think, Regal Beloit. So you have the Menominee Valley becomes by far the most important industrial real estate in the entire state of Wisconsin. Tens of thousands of jobs. So a major part of the economy here in Milwaukee and Wisconsin. And you keep on going up the Menominee Valley, up the stream, and back in 1903 you had one Harley and one Davidson. The experiment was designed for a motorized bicycle. And almost like a kid's clubhouse, they built this 10 by 15 foot shed in the backyard of the Davidson family home on 38th and Highland. And they built eventually number 1, which has pride of place in the museum over here in the Menominee Valley. And they made 4 motorcycles in their first year. By 1917, they were making 18,000 across the street from this shed. And their Harley Park was still there. So long tenure in one place. And you have, as Milwaukee industrializes, as we become the machine shop of the world, you have all these jobs, so you have all these immigrants who come over to take those jobs. And now it's no longer the German, Irish, Scandinavian, it's more the southern and eastern parts of the continent. And the biggest group there was the Poles. They're Milwaukee's second largest group by 1900, distant second with the Germans. The typical sizable Polish extended family. They settled largely on the south side, and just as North 3rd King Drive was the downtown for the Germans, Mitchell Street became downtown for the Poles, called the Polish Grand Avenue in some circles. They had also a very unusual settlement just a little bit east of us here at Brockwell on Jones Island, which was never an island, but you have by 1900, 1,600 people living there and fishing, commercial fishermen. The so-called Kashubians were from the Baltic Sea coast of Poland. They would bring up like 2 million pounds of fish in a year. So this is protein for the populace, and probably started the Milwaukee Fish Fry, probably where it began down on Jones Island. And they were devout members of St. Stanislaus Church, which was the first Polish church in any American city. It was back to 1866. So not only came here in large numbers, but came here early. And St. Stan's was the mother of roughly 20 Polish congregations around town. including St. Joseph's Basilica, built in 1901 with material established from the Chicago Post Office. This would be LEED platinum. Have there been such a thing? It's completely recycled back in 1901. So you have, the poles are large, and the Italians come a little later, 1890s. And in Milwaukee, if you're Italian, chances are really good you're Sicilian. And there's a difference. The country itself has a lot of cultural differences, and most Milwaukee Italians are from the boot or from the island of Sicily. These are the Bucciolacchis. They did pretty well in the macaroni business. They settled in the third ward after the Irish had left for neighbors like Merrill Park, and they worked like the Irish with their backs on their hands. The ones who had kind of this itch to own their own businesses would begin in areas that had kind of a low barrier to entry, especially fresh, wholesale fruit and vegetables. So they began with hand-drawn push carts, graduate to horse-drawn carts. This is Tony Macchi. His family's still in business, still doing produce. And the ones who were very successful would have their own commission houses on Broadway, Commission Row in the Third Ward. As you know, the Third Ward has gone in different directions. So designer clothes and fancy chocolates. But Broadway was the center. If your ancestors got fresh produce, they got it here back in those early years. And by 1905, they were big enough to have their own church. Again, this is what, 40 years after St. Mark. But they built Our Lady of Pompeii on Jackson Street, and that became the center of worship for Milwaukee Sicilians, and became Milwaukee's first official landmark in 1969. The same year, it was destroyed to make way for I-794. Didn't have a real preservation ordinance with teeth in it back then. You have Milwaukee by 1900. You have these two forces. You want to sort of talk about the complexity of life in the city, but you can sum up what was going on here and elsewhere in just two words: immigrants and industries. Back in 1890, immigrants and their kids made up 86% of Milwaukee's population. 86%, almost 9 in 10. That made Milwaukee the most, quote, foreign city in the entire country. I wonder where the festivals come from. Been at this for a very long time. Around the same time, 1910, 57% of Milwaukee's adult males worked in manufacturing. That was second only to Detroit. So you have these jobs and people to fill them. You have these two things join to swell Milwaukee's population to 375,000 by 1910. And that was good for 12th place in the country. Before the Sun Belt, for all the migration, kind of south and west, but we were number 12. Probably for a time, maybe cracked the top 10 for a time. So Milwaukee became a big city and had the big city problems to prove it. At a time when coal was burned for everything, you had just horrendous air pollution. The Milwaukee River was an open sewer, and that is not a metaphor. It had all the waste from Milwaukee out to the Milwaukee Harbor. You had a growing gulf between capital and labor. These are the puddlers, a skilled trade in the Bayview rolling mill. These guys made $5 a day. Their helpers made $1.25 a day for 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week. So it was just a harsh economic system. Not surprisingly, they organized early and often. Back in 1886, a national union called the Knights of Labor was formed, and its cause was the 8-hour day without a cut in pay. It's a big deal if you're working 12 hours a day, coming down to 8. Certainly a huge improvement. Milwaukee became, with Chicago, an epicenter of that movement. General strike was called to shut down the city on May 1st, 1886. The governor called out the militia and pretty much trying to preserve industrial order. And there was one employer remained open, that was the Bayview Rolling Mill. On the morning of May 5th, 1886, a crowd of roughly 1,500 strikers, largely Polish, marched from St. Stan's down to Bayview. They found the militia waiting for them. At a distance of roughly 200 yards, they opened fire. Killed 7 people, including a 13-year-old schoolboy who was playing hooky, and a retiree just watching from his backyard. It was the bloodiest labor disturbance in Wisconsin's history. This is one of the fatalities, shot in a mob, Michael Ruhalski. And it broke the back of the 8-hour movement, but it also galvanized working-class sentiment for political change. And that was one force in the advent of socialism here in Milwaukee. So, yeah, David Rose was another reason people mobilized. He was the most corrupt mayor Milwaukee's ever had. Said he lived to see his people at play and happy. And prostitution flourished in the morning shadow of City Hall. And Victor Berger was the spearhead the movement of socialism here in Milwaukee. And by 1898, the running candidates for office, and these guys won acclaim as incorruptible and diligent and creative. So watch the guy on the upper right here, Amos Seidel, was a pattern maker by trade, becomes Milwaukee's first socialist mayor in 1910. And it was not a fluke. We have Dan Holm follows between 1916 and 1940, Frank Zyder from 48 to 60. For most of 50 years, Milwaukee has socialist mayors, and nobody else did that in the entire country. And what they did very simply was they turned Milwaukee around. What had been a boss-ridden, thoroughly corrupt administration became a paragon of civic virtue. And there is no doubt that the high point was during Dan Holm's tenure. Milwaukee won award after award as the safest, healthiest, cleanest city in the entire country. Holm got his picture on the cover of Time magazine back in 1936, and Time declared Milwaukee the best governed city in the U.S. So, amazing turnaround. And there's one legacy of that period that's still very much here. 15,000 acres of public green space in Milwaukee County. 5 times per capita what Chicago has. And that's absolutely the result of visionaries like Charles Whitnell, the socialist who was the godfather of Milwaukee's park system. It's appropriate that he has the largest park in the city, the county named for him, up there on the southwest side. So things are looking up, but Milwaukee was soon facing pressures that had nothing to do with the locality, including World War I. We jump in 1917, and the old stereotype of the culture, German, Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, is replaced by this cartoon of the bloody Hun. So ethnic cleansing goes on. Sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage. Hamburg becomes Salisbury steak. So you have this kind of complete cutting off German culture at the knees. 1919, just a couple of years, 1 year after the war ended, Prohibition begins. This is a mock funeral for John Barleycorn. They're trying very hard not to smile. That drought lasted for 14 years and forced Milwaukee breweries into some rather bizarre business lines. The Eline family made chocolate bars and a plant of the Port Road right around Hampton. And even though it was a law of the land, you could always get a drink in Milwaukee. Dan Ho said prohibition is a big joke. He had the whole U.S. Army, he could not prevent illegal drinking. And around the same time, 1924, Congress passed a couple of blatantly racist immigration laws that cut off labor from Southern and Eastern Europe. So that was the end of sort of so-called new immigration. As that door closed, another one opened, and this is the beginning of the Great Migration in Black American history. So you have, this door opens wide, and the population rises from about 1,000 in 1900 to 7,500 in 1930, working largely in factories, but also on street gangs like this asphalt crew working for We Energies. And you have the beginning of Bronzeville, the birth of Bronzeville in the 1920s. And you have churches being major institutions. This is Calvary Baptist. And you have fraternal organizations, the Odd Fellows and conventions, kind of an analog of the white fraternals, and baseball teams. So you have a complete community going way back to the 1920s into the 1930s. And you have around the same time, a little later 20s, Latinos begin to arrive, and they're settled largely because they're offered jobs at tanneries. Mr. Vogel is a major employer of Mexican labor, and they become the major group in this area around the old tannery district, Walker's Point. The reason there are so many good Mexican restaurants here is because it's close to employment. From those years back when this was largely tannery district. In 1926, they began their place of worship, our Holy Trinity Guadalupe, back in a storefront on South Fifth Street. And in 1930 was the first parade marking Independence Day. And just to chart the growth, began on National Avenue, moved to Mitchell, it's now Oklahoma Avenue. You kind of see the growth of Milwaukee's Latino population. So you have the start of Milwaukee's truly global diversity of the present, but progress was derailed by the Depression, 10 years of suffering and want. This is Lincoln Park, Hooverville. People lost their jobs, 40% unemployment, and they lost their jobs, they lost their homes. So people are living in parks because they had no place else to go. And roughly half of the population went on relief by the time the Depression had ended. And you have one bright spot was all these New Deal work relief programs, WPA, CCC, and ARA, and others. So they were trying to put as many guys to work as they could on manual labor. What's more manual than parks? So Milwaukee had thousands of guys working in park development. This is Lincoln Park. By the time the Depression ended, you had Milwaukee's park development was 10 to 15 years ahead of schedule. So bright spot in that very dark time. What brought the economy back to life was the build-up for World War II. This is the Kearney Trimper Shop, it's now Quad Graphics. And you have, as the guys went off to war, it was women who kept these plants going. You have about 25% of the workforce was female by 1944. Teresa Landolf was the champion welder in the chain belt shop, and she said, I can do my job as well as any man, and no one to challenge her. But think of this period between 30 and 45, 15 years of privation and pressure. People were starved for good news, so in 1945, a duck lays her eggs in a downtown bridge pilot. A sports writer calls her Gertie, and people starved for good news were gathered by the hundreds in the Wisconsin Avenue Bridge to watch a duck. You're down there on the pilings. You're not commemorating the statues there. So you have, finally, the war ends, and you have victory in Europe and in Japan, and there were fears the economy would just tank again. But just the opposite happened. You had 15 years of built-up demand, so that almost overnight, these farm fields on the northwest side are filled with subdivisions. You have gridlock in the center of town, which gives rise to a very ambitious freeway program in the 1960s. And you have that building booms accompanied by all kinds of civic projects that the GMC was very important and forward. War Memorial Center opens back in 1957. Other landmarks, the Public Museum, about to make another move, not too far away. The Milwaukee County Zoo moves from Washington Park out to 100th and Blue Mound. And the Domes opened as kind of a zoo for plants back in the 1960s. By far the most iconic structure was Milwaukee County Stadium, what was back in '53. We set a national league tennis record in the very first year, and just 4 years later, we beat the Yankees. So Bushville wins. Small city pride triumphs over big city might. And you have change in politics as well. Henry Meyer becomes mayor in 1960, stays for 28 years. On his watch, not his fault, but on his watch, you have problems that have been festering for years, especially light and poverty in the heart of Milwaukee Central City. Too often, people would come here from the South or Chicago and find substandard housing, substandard employment. So a civil rights movement gets going back in the 1960s. The first cause was school integration. That's Lloyd Barbie on the right side of the photograph. In '67, open housing becomes the cause. And the most visible leader there was a white priest named Father James Grabbi, product of Milwaukee's Bayview Italian community. And just the sheer novelty of a white priest having a leadership position made him kind of a national figure, but also one of several people who kind of spearheaded the demand for civil rights in Milwaukee. Those movement was kind of interrupted by a riot back in '67 when Milwaukee became one of the 100 U.S. cities to experience violence. Before long, it was economic bad news making the headlines. Recession back in 1982, savage manufacturing. We lost a quarter of our manufacturing jobs in 4 years, in '79 and '83. Alice Chalmers, that once had 25,000 workers, went bankrupt. And the walls came down, and the old erecting shops became a strip mall. You can now get a haircut or buy shoes in the old erecting shops, and they left behind the Harder-Steger crane. It's still there. So you have that bad news kept on going. Tower Automotive, the old A.L. Smith closed back in '06. 9,000 workers, many of them African American, that closed, and that really undercut what had been a promising rise to middle class status for many. So just the last few slides here. Life is always light and darkness, yin and yang, and there have been positive developments as well. Summerfest debuts back in 1968 as what became the world's largest music festival. You have, in the 60s, no one cared about historic architecture, but we began to realize what we'd lose by tearing down these landmarks. Half Mansion becomes our favorite house museum, and old neighborhoods come roaring back to life that had been kind of given up for dead. And people kind of rediscover an interest in ethnic heritage. Irish Fest is now the biggest, 100,000 people, whether it rains or shines. So the story's always renewing itself. Since the '70s, there have been a huge immigration of people from Southeast Asia. And the story is repeating itself today. Our more recent refugees are from Myanmar and from Sub-Saharan Africa. So the languages, the climate they came from could not be more different from what they found that they had in the old company, but it's the same story. It has been since the mid-1800s. So even the natives have returned. The Potawatomi opened their casino back in 1991, and whatever you think about Indian gaming, poetic justice is being served here. The valley was a hugely important source of wealth for their ancestors, and they're reclaiming that wealth one gambler at a time. And the last couple slides, today Milwaukee looks back on 414 Day at roughly 200 years of urban growth and change. It's a story that has certainly produced big league problems, but also big league amenities, ranging from world-class festivals to world-class diversity, all set in one of the most livable cities in the entire country. I have a friend who says Milwaukee's a great city, a lot's going on, but you can still find a place to park. So after all these years, we have a couple of 21st century landmarks that kind of symbolize a spirit here. After all these years, Milwaukee is still a city that is open to the future and still spreading its wings to all the possibilities of tomorrow. Thank you and happy 414.
John, thank you so much for joining us today. Your words remind us why we focus our collaborative efforts on learning from the historic challenges to illuminate the opportunities for the future. So thanks again, John. Thanks to Rockwell for having us here today. Thanks to Senator Baldwin for being here today. We're going to wrap up with saying our next meeting is May 12th at Foley and Lardner. And today's giveaway is to Kristen Dufik. We celebrate Milwaukee with a gift card to treat yourself to Milwaukee swag from 414 Milwaukee. Have a great day.
Okay. Yeah.